Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a wonderful week. I've had an insanely busy week. I feel as though I've been running faster than a fat turkey on Thanksgiving, and yet I feel as though I've done nothing. I even missed out on like 3 naps, and anyone who knows me knows I love my naps. This past weekend was Thanksgiving for those of us in Canada, and I hope that all of my Canadian listeners had a wonderfully relaxing and safe holiday. And I hope you all took time to cherish the time you spent with those you love and enjoyed lots of turkey. Turkey's a great thing to have right before a nap. See, it all comes back to the naps. I took a few days off this week to get ready for Thanksgiving and spend some time with my family, and that's why there was no episode last week, but I'm back this week with a brand new episode for you. That's about it from my little corner of Ontario. Let's get into the business. If you enjoy this episode or any episode, please head over to the Patreon page and support the show. The link is in the show notes. As well, you can support the show on Spotify. Make sure you tap that follow button and the like button, or give it a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening on. If you have any ideas for future episodes or just want to drop me a line and say, hey, I'm listening, email me at thebitterwitness@gmail.com. Well, that's enough of the business. Both dogs are sleeping behind me, so Puppy ASMR will be brought to you by both Miley and Piper this week. So grab a cup of tea, sit back, and relax while I tell you about the murder of Artemus Ogletree in room 1046. The mysterious murder of Artemus Ogletree remains one of the most perplexing unsolved cases in American criminal history, captivating the imagination of true crime enthusiasts and casual readers alike, leaving investigators and the public in a whirlwind of speculation and intrigue. The circumstances surrounding the case were baffling and has generated countless theories, ranging from drug deals gone awry to romantic entanglements. Yet no conclusive evidence has emerged to shed light on a motive or who the perpetrator could have been. As decades have passed since that fateful night, the enigma of room 1046 continues to haunt the corridors of the hotel and the minds of those who learn about it. The strange details, such as the bizarre circumstances of the victim's injuries, conversations with hotel staff, and the cryptic messages he supposedly received, all contribute to the allure of this unsolved mystery. The murder in room 1046 is particularly fascinating because it raises questions about identity, privacy, and the specter of violence lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. The victim, despite leaving little evidence behind, has become a haunting figure representing the many faces of lost stories and the victims of unsolved crimes. To this day, room 1046 stands as a testament to the enduring allure of mystery and unsettling reminders that even in seemingly ordinary settings, the extraordinary can unfold, leaving behind questions that fuel our curiosity and thirst for understanding. Each retelling invites us to explore the complexities of human nature, the shadows of deception, and the haunting specter of unsolved trauma. As I was sifting through the remnants of this case, I found myself drawn not only to the desire for answers, but to the possibility that perhaps some mysteries are meant to endure, forever tantalizing us with their unresolved tales. As always, I want to give the victims in this case top billing. Artemus, Ruby, I acknowledge you and send my love to you wherever you may be. During Prohibition, Kansas City was controlled by mob boss Tom Pendergast, who had the chief of police, Otto Higgins, under his thumb. So needless to say, Prohibition was not really a thing in Kansas City. The city was a popular haven for debauchery and crime. It was known as a wide open town where jazz clubs were open all night and partying police would turn a blind eye to the dealings of Pendergast and his associates. The 30s were a time of sin and overindulging in life's illicit pleasures. Later, Chief Higgins would be arrested and convicted on tax evasion for the role he played in the lawless state that Kansas City became. But at the time, Kansas City would have been just the place that would pique the interest of a young man looking for adventure. On January 2nd, 1935, a man walked into the lobby of the Hotel President in Kansas City. He checked in under the name Roland T. Owen from Los Angeles. The hotel staff stated that the man had brown hair, looked to be between 20 and 35 years old. He had what seemed to be a scar on the side of his head, where there was a bald patch, and he had cauliflower ear. For those who don't know what a cauliflower ear is, it's an injury that's usually formed from repeated hard blows to the ear or head. The resulting injury is that your ear looks lumpy or bulgy. Is that a word? It is now. Bulgy. What happens is the skin covering the cartilage in your ear will separate from that cartilage, and because the skin is what brings the blood to the cartilage, that blood will pool in between the skin and the cartilage. As the injuries from the blows heals, the ear will fold in on itself, which is what gives it that bulgy look. This injury is often seen in boxers or wrestlers or UFC fighters today. I'll post a picture of it because it's weird, and I like weird. The hotel clerk at the desk gives Roland T. Owen the key for room 1046 and calls Randolph Probst, the bellboy, to come and assist the man up to his room. Randolph will tell police that he thought it was weird because Roland T. Owen had no luggage. And once they arrived at the room, Randolph saw that the man's toothbrush, hairbrush, and toothpaste were all sticking out of a pocket on the man's long black coat. A little while later, after checking into the room, one of the chambermaids, a Mary Soptic, knocks on the door to room 1046. Mary asks if she can come in and give the room a quick once-over. Roland tells her to come in. When Mary enters the room, she's a little taken back by how dark it is. All of the shades are drawn, and every light is off except one small lamp on a table. Now she has brass balls because there is no way I would have gone in to clean a room without lights. I would have stayed in the doorway, taken a quick look around, and said, "You know what? It looks fine to me," and I would have hightailed it the fuck out of there. Not Mary, though. She went in and cleaned the room. Later, Mary would state that while she was in room 1046, in the dark, with Roland Owen, he seemed quite anxious, even paranoid. Mary finished her cleaning and started to head towards the door. Roland called out from the corner, "Leave the door unlocked. I'm expecting a friend to arrive shortly." Mary shut the door, leaving it unlocked for whoever was coming to see Roland, and went on with her workday. At approximately 4 p.m., Mary returned to room 1046 with some clean towels. She knocked on the door, and a voice told her to come in. When she entered the room, there was only light from that small lamp on the table in the corner of the room, and this time she found Roland Owen lying on the bed, fully clothed. Mary would later tell police that when she was making her way to the bathroom, she noticed a note on the table that read, Dawn, I'll be back in 5 minutes. Wait. The hotel president had some really weird doors on their rooms. By today's standards, definitely not up to fire code. These doors you could apparently lock from the outside with a key, and when that lock was engaged, you couldn't open the door from the inside. I've never heard of this type of door being on a hotel room, but apparently they existed or exist still. I have no idea, but they did back then. The next morning, so now we're on January 3rd, around 10:30, Mary headed back up to room 1046 to do her daily cleaning. When she knocked, there was no answer from the room. Mary assumed that Roland had gone out. She went to open the door, only to find it had been locked from the outside, pretty much confirming what Mary thought, that Roland had gone out. Mary used her passkey and entered the room. When she opened the door, she was terrified to find Roland sitting silently on the bed. The room was dark from all the shades being drawn. Mary stated that he was just sitting there in the room without making a sound. And because the door had been locked from the outside, that meant that someone had intentionally locked Roland inside the room. Well, Brass Ball Mary went in and started cleaning the room. And that would be a big nope from me right there. Some creepy guy just sitting in a hotel room in the dark, fully clothed on his bed and locked in by someone else? Nope. Mary stated that while she was cleaning the room, Roland received a call. She could only hear Roland's side of the conversation, but all he said was, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I just had breakfast. No, I'm not hungry." Mary finished her cleaning and left Roland sitting silently in the dark room. Later that day, around 4 p.m., Mary went back to room 1046 with fresh towels, just as she had done the day before. This time, when Mary got to the door, she could hear two men arguing loudly inside the room. She knocked and called out, "Housekeeping, I have fresh towels for you." Mary stated that a man with a very rough voice, who she didn't believe was Roland, answered back, "We don't need any towels." Mary thought this was a bit abrupt, but left the room and continued on with her day. Later that night, a guest staying in room 1048 would state that she heard loud voices coming from one of the rooms on the floor. She claimed that they were both male and female voices, and that they were cursing quite a bit. Now, these voices could have been coming from Roland Owen's room at 1046, but that evening there was also a large party going on in room 1055. The woman in 1048 may have just heard the party in full swing. Elevator lift operator Charles Blocker reported that during that night he had been very busy taking people up to the party on the 10th floor. Later, Charles would tell the police that at one point during the evening, a woman dressed in a black Hudson seal coat entered the elevator. Charles said she was short and slight in stature. He said he noticed her because of the coat. The woman asked to be taken to the 10th floor. Then the woman asked Charles where she would be able to find room 1026. Charles stated that when the woman asked him for directions, his memory clicked, and he remembered that he had seen this woman before, and she had ridden the elevator with Charles on several occasions to visit the rooms of different men. According to Charles, this woman was a, quote, commercial woman, unquote. I like that, commercial woman. Charles let the woman in black out on the 10th floor and returned to the lobby. But about 5 minutes later, the elevator was called up to the 10th floor again. When the elevator doors opened on the 10th floor, the woman in black stood before the doors. She stepped into the elevator and told Charles that she had the wrong room number because no one was in room 1026. Then the woman wondered if Maybe she was supposed to go to room 1024 because there was a light on in that room. The woman got off the elevator and hurried off to see if room 1024 was where she was supposed to be going. Charles closed the elevator doors and returned to the lobby. After about 30 minutes, the elevator was once again called up to the 10th floor. When the doors opened, the woman in black was waiting for the elevator. She got on with Charles, rode down to the lobby without saying a word, and then left the hotel. About an hour later, the woman in black returned to the hotel and summoned the elevator. But this time, she was accompanied by a man dressed all in brown. Charles described the man in brown as almost identical to the commercial woman in both height and stature. So, a pretty small man. When Charles arrived in the lobby with the elevator, the man and woman got on the elevator and asked to be taken to the 9th floor. At 4:15 a.m., the elevator was called up to the 9th floor. When Charles arrived and opened the door, there stood the woman in black. She entered the elevator and took it down to the lobby and exited the hotel. 15 minutes later, the elevator was called up to the 9th floor again. When Charles opened the doors this time, there stood the man in brown waiting for the elevator. He entered the elevator and explained to Charles that he couldn't sleep and he was hoping that a walk would help him to tire out. He then rode the elevator down to the lobby and exited the hotel. No staff member of the hotel president would ever see the man in brown again. Charles's story of the woman in black and the man in brown was backed up by the hotel's night clerk, James Haddon. During the night, the hotel switchboard operator noticed that the phone in room 1046 was off the hook. So he sent a bellboy up to the room to have the situation corrected. The bellboy knocked, but no one answered. And since the bellboy didn't have a pass key, he went back down to the lobby without having put the phone back on the hook. Later in the morning of January 4th, switchboard operator Della Cole took over the switchboard. Just after she started her shift, Della noticed that the phone in room 1046 was off the hook. She sent bellboy Randolph Probst up to the room to see what was going on. When Randolph arrived at the room, he saw a Do Not Disturb sign hung on the door, but he decided to knock anyways. After a few times of knocking on the door, Randolph heard a male voice that said, "Come in, turn on the lights." Randolph attempted to open the door, but it was locked from the inside. He knocked a few more times, hoping that whoever was in the room would open the door, but no one came to the door. Randolph decided that whoever was in the room was likely still drunk from the night before. He yelled through the door, "Put your phone back on the hook." And with that, Randolph returned to the lobby. About an hour and a half later, around 8:30, Della Cole saw that once again, room 1046's light was on her switchboard, meaning the phone was still off the hook. This time, she sent bellboy Harold Pike up to the room to fix the issue. Once Harold had arrived at the room, he realized that the door was locked, so he used his pass key and let himself into the room. Once he was in the room, Harold didn't turn on the lights, but from the light coming in from the hallway, he noticed that there was a figure lying on the bed. He saw that the man was naked and that the bedding was darker around the body. But Harold assumed that either the dark spot on the bed was a shadow created by the man, or that the man was intoxicated and had soiled himself while sleeping off his drunk. Harold looked for the phone and saw that the stand and the phone itself had fallen off the table and to the ground. Quietly, Harold tiptoed over and put the phone back into its proper place, and then quickly and quietly exited the room. Around 11 o'clock a.m., Della noticed that annoying white light was on again for room 1046, which meant that damn phone was off the hook again. She summoned bellboy Randolph Probst and told him to go into the room and fix the problem once and for all. Randolph went to the room and knocked, hoping that whoever was in the room would open the door for him, instead of him having to let himself in. No such luck. Randolph used his passkey and opened the door. Once the door had swung open, the scene that lay before Randolph was one of absolute terror. There was a man not 2 feet from the door, on his knees and elbows, holding the sides of his head with both hands. Randolph could see blood on the man's head. Randolph quickly flicked on the light and gasped. The entire room was saturated with blood. There was blood on the walls, on the floors, on the bed, and in the bathroom. And although Randolph didn't see it, there was also blood on the ceiling, too. Randolph's flight instinct kicked in, and he turned and hightailed it back down to the lobby, screaming for help. The police were called, and upon arriving at room 1046, they found Roland T. Owen inside the bathtub with his feet sticking out. Roland had been bound by the neck, wrists, and ankles with a white cord. The doctor on the scene described the cord as similar to clothesline. Roland's neck was severely bruised, which suggested that someone was pulling on the cord hard enough to make those marks. In other words, attempted strangulation. Roland had also been stabbed more than once in the chest above the heart, and one of those stab wounds had punctured his lung. The right side of his skull had 3 fractures, suggesting that he had received some pretty hard blows to the head. The doctor estimated that based on the dried blood on Roland, the wounds were approximately 6 to 7 hours old. The police kept asking Roland, "Who did this to you?" Roland's answer, "Nobody. I fell and hit my head on the bathtub." They asked Roland if he had tried to kill himself. Roland answered, "No." Shortly after this last answer, Roland lost consciousness and was rushed to a hospital, but by the time he arrived, he had slipped into a coma. The man known as Roland T. Owen died shortly after midnight on January 5th, 1935. According to the Kansas City Police, all of Roland's clothing was missing from the room, except for a label that appeared to be torn from a cheap necktie. The other items found in the room were a hairpin, an unsmoked cigarette, a glass bearing a woman's fingerprint, and an unused bottle of dilute sulfuric acid. When I first read that, I thought, what is this? But then I Googled what dilute sulfuric acid actually was. It's an acid, but as acids go, it will just burn your skin or your throat if you drink it. And there is a slight chance that it could burn off your fingerprints, but it would take a lot. And remember, this bottle was full, so it wasn't actually used for anything. For all we know, it could have been in the room before Roland got there. The Kansas City Police determined quickly that there was no one named Roland T. Owen living in Los Angeles, meaning they didn't know the true identity of the man who died in room 1046. So law enforcement decided to see if anyone from the public knew who the man was. Roland's body was put on display at McGillie's Memorial, a funeral home, where thousands of people came to view the body. One man who came to view the body out of pure morbid curiosity was a water department employee named Robert Lane. Robert waited in line to see the body on display, and when it was finally his turn to view, Robert's mouth fell open. Robert knew the man inside the casket. Well, he didn't know him, but he had spoken with him. On January 3rd, Robert was driving home from work around 11 p.m. when a man without a coat stepped into the street and flagged him down as if he were a cab. Robert felt bad for the guy because it was horrible weather outside, and the man didn't have a coat. So he stopped his car to offer the man a ride. When the man got into his car, Robert could see that the man was injured. There was a bleeding scratch on the man's arm, and he seemed to be doubling over in pain. The man kept looking out the back window of the car as if he were expecting someone to be chasing him. The man finally realized that Robert was not a cabbie and the car he was in was not a taxi, and he asked if Robert would take him to a cab. Robert agreed and then tried to make polite conversation with the man. "You look like you've been in it bad," Robert stated to the man. But the man didn't answer. He just continued looking out the window and muttered, "I'll kill that redacted word tomorrow." When the newspapers ran this part of the story back in the day, they removed the curse word. I'm sure if we worked together, we could come up with some of our own. Let's see. That fucker tomorrow, that asshole tomorrow, that son of a bitch tomorrow. See, this is fun. Cursing is so cathartic. Oh, right, sorry. Back to Robert Lane. According to Robert, those were the last words the man spoke to him, as right after that, Robert and his passenger arrived at a cab stand, and the man got out of his car and made his way across the street and jumped into a waiting cab. And now, Robert was staring at this man in the casket. Robert informed the police of his encounter with the man, but it still didn't help to figure out who Roland T. Owen was. And later, the police would dismiss Robert's story that the man in the car was Roland Owen, because the hotel staff stated that they didn't remember seeing Roland return to the hotel that night with any injuries, and the medical examiner in the case had stated that the injuries on Roland's body were not that old based on his observations. When Roland had checked into the hotel president, he had been complaining to Randolph and to Mary Soptic that he had been staying at the Muleback Hotel, but they had tried to increase his rate to $5 a night, and that was just outrageous, which is why he left and came to the hotel president. Police went to the Muleback Hotel and interviewed the staff there. But the staff at the Muleback informed police that there was never a man with the name Roland T. Owen staying at their hotel. But the front desk clerk told the police that a man matching Roland's description had stayed there the night in question, but he had listed his name as Eugene K. Scott from Los Angeles. Another lead that the police discovered was that Roland T. Owen had also used the name Cecil Warner. The man using this name had tried to sign up for some cash wrestling matches. These matches were most likely underground, which would allow betting on the outcome, and the wrestlers would get paid. If they survived the match, that is. With nothing to go on, the police then turned to other law enforcement agencies for help. They started collaborating with departments all across the country to see if anyone had a report of a missing man with the specific scar on the side of his head. Sadly, that turned up nothing as well. The police had to face facts, and so they announced that, sadly, the man would be buried in a potter's field, which is a place for unknown or unclaimed people to be buried. Once this announcement was made, the police received a phone call from an anonymous man. The man said that Roland should be buried in Memorial Park, a cemetery in Kansas City. And the caller also informed the police that they would pay for the entire burial. The police asked the caller why they would offer to pay for a stranger's burial. The man on the phone simply answered, Owen hadn't played the game fair, and cheaters usually get what's coming to them. And with that, the man on the phone hung up. The money for the burial arrived, and a small funeral ceremony was held for Roland T. Owen's burial. On the day of the funeral and burial, 13 roses in the genus American Beauty arrived at the cemetery, with instructions to be placed at the graveside for the funeral. With the roses was a card that read, "Love forever, Louise." After the burial, Roland's case and picture were featured in American Weekly and Official Detective Stories magazines, two extremely popular magazines at the time. Hundreds of letters came flooding in from all over the country with theories about the case, from Roland getting involved with a mobster's daughter to him being part of a German spy ring. Finally, after almost 2 years, Roland T. Owen was identified by his mother, Ruby Ogletree, as Artemus Ogletree. The scar on the side of his head had been the result of a grease burn when Artemus was only 11 months old. Ruby stated that her son was an adventurous kind of boy, and in April of 1934, at the age of 19, he had set off from Birmingham, Alabama, hitchhiking across the country with a friend of his by the name of Joe Simpson. According to the letter that Joe would later write to Kansas City police and Ruby, the two friends had made it to Los Angeles, where they had parted ways. According to Ruby, Artemus had arrived in Kansas City in the middle of August and first had stayed at the St. Regis Hotel. Here, police discovered that Artemus had checked in the company of another man who signed the registry as Don Kelso. Sometime between Christmas and New Year's, something had happened which caused Artemus's situation to change, and he moved from the St. Regis Hotel to the Muehlebach Hotel. At the Muehlebach Hotel, Artemus used a fake name to check in, but after a very short stay there, he left and walked into the hotel president, checking in as Roland T. Owen. But we're not done yet. Now comes the weirder aspects of this case. According to Ruby, Artemus's mother, someone had been communicating with her in the 2 years between Artemus's death and when she was finally able to identify him. Ruby stated that just 2 weeks after Artemus died, she received a typewritten letter from Artemus telling her that he was going to New York City. Ruby said that the way the letter was worded seemed strange and not in the normal way that her son would speak to her in his letters. But even more strange to Ruby was that the letter was typed. Artemus had no idea how to type, and all of his letters up to that point had been handwritten. In April, after Artemus had died, Ruby received another letter, again typed, not handwritten. This letter told Ruby that her son was currently sailing for France. Letters that were sent to Ruby from Artemus before his death were all written in his hand and for the most part are simple and to the point. Normally, the topic of conversation usually fell onto Artemus's job prospects. For example, one letter from Artemus to his mother read, "I think that fellow I told you about was going to open a business and give me half interest in it. He has definitely made up his mind to open in the spring. He is about the best friend I have. He has a big Cadillac, and we are going to Excelsior Springs next week in it." The letters that were typewritten and sent to Ruby were different in tone. They seemed to have a flair for the dramatic and were chocked full with outlandish detail and period slang, which Ruby claimed Artemus wouldn't do. And she stood by that throughout her entire life. An example from one of the typewritten letters. "I got poisoned on something I ate in some dump. I was laid up for a few days and my stomach pained me a lot, but I finally got over that. Then I got the flu and had to go to bed for almost 9 weeks. I guess I was pretty sick." On August 12, 1935, 8 months after Artemus had died, Ruby received a long-distance phone call from a man claiming to be a good friend of Artemus. The caller told her that his name was Godfrey Jordan and that he and Artemus had met in Cairo, Egypt. Godfrey told Ruby that Artemus had saved him from a band of thugs, and the two had become fast friends after that. Ruby stated that the call lasted for about 45 minutes and that when it was done, Ruby was feeling quite unsettled. Remember, at this point, Artemus is dead, but Ruby doesn't know it. Now, throughout the time that Ruby was receiving all these letters, she was growing quite concerned for Artemus. And so by November of 1935, she had written to the State Department to see if her son had a passport, to the customs authorities to see if he'd set sail without a passport, to the American consulate in Cairo, and to the FBI. And in January of 1936, a year after Artemus had died, although Ruby didn't know, she wrote to President Franklin Roosevelt. Within her letter to the president, the following can be found. I fear he has fallen into some gang or something has happened to him. He's always been a good boy and has high ideals. I simply must find some trace of him. If he's in trouble, I want to know. The investigators felt that Artemis's death had a somewhat sexual deviance aspect to it. And so even back in the 30s, the police did the old pervert roundup. Men across the country were asked for their fingerprints and handwriting samples to see how their handwriting compared to Don Kelso's name in the St. Regis Hotel registry. Now let's look at some of the suspects that we have. In 1940, law enforcement honed in on a man named Thomas Wilbur Barlow, who had been convicted of the charge Crimes Against Nature, which according to the Kansas police involved a murder that had been committed by a sex maniac. Police felt that Thomas Barlow's signature looked a lot like Don Kelso's signature in the registry at St. Regis. But after about 10 hours of questioning, the police let Thomas go and publicly stated that he had given different stories throughout his long interrogation. But they believed that he had come to these different accounts because he was suffering from syphilis. Nice. Nothing like having the police feel that you're a sex maniac who kills people because you might have the clap. And let's not think about the man's privacy if he did have syphilis. Let's just announce it to the world. The lead detective on Artemis's case was a Detective T.J. Higgins. Name sound familiar? As in Chief Otto Higgins? Nepotism is a wonderful thing, isn't it? TJ was convinced that a man in New York was the killer named Joseph Ogden. Ogden was a convicted killer. He had murdered a man named George Cynical and then proceeded to cut off a distinctive tattoo from Oliver's body with a knife. Then Joseph Ogden had taken Oliver's nude body and stuffed it into a steamer trunk that was bound for Memphis. But at Penn Station, the trunk was seen as suspicious and opened by officials, which is when Oliver's body was discovered. Joseph Ogden had served several sentences in Sing Sing prison and 2 insane asylums. One of these asylums was in Birmingham, Alabama, where Artemis was from. There was never anything found that linked Joseph Ogden and Artemis, but his records did indicate that Ogden was a successful prison escapee and tended to lean towards homosexuality. All of these pieces helped convince TJ that Ogden was the man who killed Artemis. But the tipping point, I think, for TJ was that one of Ogden's aliases just happened to be Don Kelso. After the fact about Don Kelso being an alias of Ogden, it wasn't just T.J. Higgins that felt sure Ogden was their man. The entire Kansas City police force felt the same. But when writing samples from Ogden were sent to the FBI for comparison with the Don Kelso that checked into the St. Regis, they didn't match. Ruby, Artemis's mom, always suspected that Joe Simpson, the friend he had gone off hitchhiking with, had something to do with her son's death. She even went so far as to write to the Kansas City police, informing them of this. Ruby also did some digging on her own. When her suspicions were cast aside by law enforcement, she went to Joe Simpson's high school and got his records to prove to police that he was a bad seed. But the police just kept telling Ruby that Joe had been interviewed and he was dismissed as a suspect in Artemis's death. Ruby wasn't done, though. She contacted Joe Simpson herself and asked to meet with him in Birmingham face to face. Personally, I think she was trying to get him to tell her the truth, but it was never meant to be. Every time Ruby had a date and time set up to meet with Joe, he would bail on her. Ruby spent years trying to get Joe to speak to her. You know, Joe, you're a real douche fuck for that. Finally, on December 28, 1939, Ruby managed to track Joe down and corner him and forced him to talk to her. Ruby relayed her almost verbatim conversation with Joe to the Kansas City police in her letters. Joe stated that he believed that the case would never break, as there were no clues and nothing left behind for G-men to work on. Ruby then told Joe, Kansas City can well boast of it being the perfect crime. Joe laughed and said, "It is. They'll never get the ones who killed him." Ruby says she eventually looked Joe square in the eyes and told him, "I would know that voice that talked to me from Memphis." Ruby stated that he turned red, dropped his eyes, and was nervous. After this occurred in the conversation, a nervous Joe offered to bring her a badly typed letter that Artemis had sent to him to prove that Artemis did actually type letters. But that never happened. Every time Ruby and Joe agreed on a time and place for Joe to produce this letter, Joe was a no-show. Ruby wrote to the Kansas City police and informed them that after speaking with Joe Simpson, she was convinced that it was he who had called her 7 months after Artemis had died. But again, they literally brushed Ruby off, telling her that Joe Simpson was not a suspect in the case. To this day, the death of Artemus Ogletree has yet to be explained. This case has taken on a life of its own within the true crime community. Many armchair detectives have put forth theories regarding the case. But unfortunately, with so much time having passed, and as far as we know, no physical evidence remaining, this is one of the cases that may never be solved. Are you ready to compile your own theory of what happened to Artemis in room 1046? Let's look at what we know about the case. Artemis and his friend Joe left Birmingham, Alabama in April of 1934 on a hitchhiking adventure across country. According to Joe, the two parted ways in L.A. According to Ruby and police, Artemis made it to Kansas City by August of 1934 and checked in under a false name with another man who used the name Don Kelso at the St. Regis Hotel. We know that at the time of Artemis's death, Kansas City was under the control of mob boss Tom Pendergast, and that the chief of police was controlled by Pendergast, meaning that underground drinking, gambling, and prize fighting was most likely doing a fine business in Kansas City. We know that Artemis had cauliflower ear, which is an injury very common in boxers, wrestlers, and street fighters. We know that Artemis tried to get hired on for some cash wrestling matches under the name of Cecil Warner. We know that Mary Soptic heard an argument between the two men inside Artemis's hotel room the night before the murder. We also know that Robert Lane picked up someone who he thought was Artemis with injuries, and that the man in Robert Lane's car stated he was going to kill someone off the next day. We know that Mary also heard Artemus on the phone with someone he called Don, and that Don was asking if Artemus wanted to eat, which makes me think that Don Kelso was still in Kansas City. We also know that even though Artemus was on the verge of death, he refused to name who had hurt him. In fact, he tried to blame his injuries on a slip in the bathroom, which we know could not have possibly caused his injuries, specifically the stab wounds. Here's my theory on the case. I feel that Don Kelso was some kind of a manager for fighters, and he worked for an underground fighting club. But I don't think it was boxing. I think it was more like street fighting inside a ring. I think that this was a gambling enterprise for Tom Pendergast, and that Chief Higgins was paid off to look the other way. I think that Artemus had been paying his way across the country by participating in prize fights, thus the cauliflower ear. And when he arrived in Kansas, he sought out the local prize-fighting people to get himself in and make some cash. And I think this is where he met Don Kelso. I think that, and remember that this is totally a guess, I think that maybe Don Kelso worked for Pendergast and was told to find a guy that would take a dive so that Pendergast could clean up on the gambling aspect of the fight. And maybe Artemus didn't take that dive, which in turn cost Pendergast a lot of money. Because of that decision, Artemus had to be killed, and I think that Don Kelso killed Artemus. I also think that Don Kelso was not his real name. I think that Don Kelso was an alias that Joe Simpson used. I don't think that Joe and Artemus parted ways in Los Angeles. And I think that the two boys got in way, way over their heads. I can think of no other reason for Joe to call Ruby and try and make her believe that Artemus was alive and cavorting off in Europe, except to cover his own ass. I personally don't think that the woman in black and the man in brown had anything to do with this. I think that she was a sex worker and the man in brown was her quote-unquote business associate. And now that you've heard my theory on the case, I would just like to say that I'm certain that Mr. Tom Pendergast was a beautiful human being, and that I in no way, shape, or form have any physical proof of this theory in any way, shape, or form. Let me repeat that. I in no way have any physical proof of my theory, just in case it happens to be correct. And again, I'm sure Mr. Pendergast was a lovely human being. So please, don't come for me, Mr. Mobster, Mr. Mafia Man, Mr. Italian, you there of Italian descent who runs a, you know what, just don't come for me. And the name I use on here, yeah, it's an alias. Although he turned out to be a really bad and corrupt cop, Police Chief Otto Higgins is quoted in an interdepartmental memo saying, "The case came nearer to being the perfect crime than any other murder Kansas City has seen in his quarter century as a detective." Well, at least he got one thing right, because 89 years later we are still wondering what happened to Artemus Ogletree. And for Ruby, sadly, she never saw justice for her son while she was still on this earth. Well, that was quite a case. I wish there was a better chance now that it could be solved, but without any physical evidence left from the original crime scene, I seriously doubt that anything will ever for certain be determined. With that, I think we'll leave it there for this week. Stay safe, get your pap tests done, and enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.